Good morning. Thanks for joining me for Devotionals today. We're continuing to read from Romans today, chapter 13, and I'm going to begin in verse 1. Paul writes, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. For whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you wish to have no fear of authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive its approval, for it is God's servant for your good. But if you do what is wrong, you should be afraid, for the authority does not bear the sword in vain. It is the servant of God to execute wrath on the wrongdoer." Now, this is a tough passage in a world where we see authority being abused, particularly where cases of police brutality are brought up in the media over and over again. And we see innocent people or people guilty of small crimes executed for those small crimes or executed for no reason whatsoever. And here we have Paul saying rulers are not a terror to good conduct but to bad. And we have evidence to the contrary. I think it's interesting to look at how Martin Luther King Jr. read Romans 13, because this has been a controversial passage for hundreds of years, if not since the very beginning of Christianity. What does it mean to follow rulers that are unjust? When Martin Luther King Jr. was asked about this directly, he talked about how in Paul's time there was an expectation that it would not be long before Jesus came again and the world came to an apocalyptic conclusion. And so, in such a world, it didn't make much sense to spend a lot of energy changing the social order when efforts would be better spent spreading the good news about Jesus, which may well have changed the social order at the end of the day. There was little hope of changing the authorities to make them Christian, even though this would eventually happen. We live in a very different world today, something that Martin Luther King Jr. knew well. And his response was to say that we have different responsibilities now. We know that it is worthwhile to work on changing the orders of society, to work on changing the governing institutions for the better. He also had a lot to say, unsurprisingly, about what to do when there is an unjust authority that makes unjust laws or that executes injustice instead of justice. And this passage from the letter from the Birmingham jail is probably the most salient one. He writes, "One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust, and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, and is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law." And maybe this is what it comes down to, though I think for each of us we have to wrestle with this passage individually. But it might just come down to, do we respect law and order? And if you do, and if you desire there to be order for society, if you desire for there to be laws that help us seek after justice, then it's not necessarily about doing exactly what the authority asks, but it's about doing what is right and pursuing authorities that are just, helping authorities become more and more just, caring for the country in which you live, and helping it to become a better one, helping it to improve, just as we ourselves individually seek to improve ourselves, even on a daily basis. This isn't an easy passage for us to deal with, and I would encourage you to wrestle with this further and to ask questions and to pray about it and ask how God is using this passage in your life. And as you do so, may you find your relationship with God and with other people deepened. Would you join me in prayer? God, you call us to walk alongside the oppressed, the poor, all while reminding us of our own poverty in spirit. Grant us courage to cry out against injustice Grant us burdened hearts that ache to see the enemies of hunger, violence, and economic injustice scattered. Help us, God, to fight for justice wherever we see the opportunity. Amen. Have a blessed day.